in the dense, forgotten marshlands of coastal Carolina, where Spanish moss hangs from ancient cypress trees like funeral shrouds, and the air itself feels heavy with unspoken history. A secret lay buried for over a century. 1, 2, 3. It was only when the engines of progress sought to tame this wild stretch of land that the earth finally gave up its dead. In the spring of 2023, a preliminary survey for a luxury coastal development stumbled upon the first anomaly. A series of depressions in the soil, too regular to be natural. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the unthinkable. For just beneath the surface, on the grounds of the old Fairhursts estate, lay what would eventually be identified as 143 unmarked graves. For there were no stones, no crosses, no names to mark their passing. Just the silent, skeletal testimony of souls vanished without a trace. This shocking discovery ripped through the quiet narrative of local history, unearthing a story far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. At the heart of this dark chapter stands a once lauded institution, the Fairhursts Benevolent Society, founded in the late 19th century, and its respected enigmatic leaders. 5, 6, 7, 4 decades, they were seen as paragons of virtue, saviors of the unfortunate. But recently uncovered documents, sealed and suppressed for generations, challenge this benevolent image, painting a picture not of charity, but of a monstrous criminal enterprise. The story of the Fairhursts is a journey into one of the most macabre and challenging chapters of American history, a tale that forces us to question everything we thought we knew about the gilded age of philanthropy and the darkness that can fester behind a facade of righteousness. Now, a word of caution. This channel isn't for everyone. We delve into the shadows, into the unsettling truths that history often prefers to forget. If you are a seeker of hidden knowledge, one of the brave souls willing to confront the uncomfortable, then you have found a home here. We are a community of truth seekers, and we are grateful to have you with us. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you never miss an expedition into the archives, and do us a favor. Comment below with the city or state you're watching from. It is a powerful reminder that this community of brave minds spans the entire globe. The discovery of those lost souls in the Carolina swamp was only the beginning. To understand what happened on that cursed land, we must travel back in time, to the very foundation of the Fairhursts Benevolent Society and the rise of its charismatic and ultimately corrupt patriarch. We must examine the public face of the institution, a face so charming and noble that it successfully concealed a level of depravity that remains chilling to this day. A carefully constructed illusion that began with a promise of perpetual care and ended in a shallow, nameless grave. The scale of the deception was staggering, a slow-burn horror story that unfolded over decades, hidden in plain sight, and it all began with one man's grand, benevolent vision. Or so it seemed. The history of what truly transpired at the Fairhurst estate is a complex web of deceit. And to untangle it, we must start at its very source, with the man who built an empire on the lie of compassion. The local historical society, once presented with the initial findings, was hesitant, almost resistant, to assist in any deeper investigation, a reaction that only deepened the initial mystery and fueled the quiet speculation that was beginning to brew among the few who knew of the discovery. 9. What secret were they, and perhaps the town itself, so keen to keep buried along with those forgotten bodies? The truth would be more horrifying than any rumor. To understand the darkness that consumed the Fairhurst estate, one must first appreciate the brilliance of its pristine, public facade. The Fairhursts Benevolent Society was established in 1888, a product of the Gilded Age, an era rife with both ostentatious wealth and profound social anxieties. 8. It was a time when benevolent societies were common, often founded by the wealthy elite to address the perceived moral and social decay of the cities. 6, 7, 8, N. They were institutions designed to provide for the poor, the widowed, and the infirm, and in doing so, to elevate the social standing of their benefactors. 10. Into this landscape stepped Josiah Fairhurst, the society's founder and charismatic leader. Josiah was a man seemingly sculpted from the very marble of 19th century respectability. He was tall, with a mane of silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold both profound empathy and unwavering authority. His voice a rich and melodic baritone, was his greatest instrument, capable of swaying civic leaders and comforting the most destitute soul with equal ease. He spoke of a higher purpose, a Christian duty to care for the forgotten flock, those who had no family, no means, and no hope left in the world. His sermons and public speeches were legendary, weaving together tales of redemption and civic responsibility, and they brought donations pouring in from across the state and beyond. The society's mission, as Josiah articulated it, was simple and noble: to provide a sanctuary, a final, dignified home for those in the twilight of their lives who had no one else to turn to. It was to be a place of peace, comfort, and perpetual care. And to house this grand vision, Josiah commissioned the construction of Fairhurst Manor, a sprawling estate on a remote stretch of coastal Carolina land, far from the squalor and noise of the city. The architecture itself was a statement. 1112-13 designed in the Gothic Revival style. The manor was a breathtaking and imposing structure of dark stone and towering spires. 1112-1415 from a distance, it appeared almost like a cathedral, its sharp, pointed arches reaching for the heavens. Yet, upon closer inspection, the building possessed a more foreboding quality. The stone walls were thick and unyielding, more akin to a fortress than a charitable home. Its many windows, tall and narrow, were made of dark, leaded glass that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, giving the impression of vacant, dead eyes staring out over the desolate marshlands. Spanish moss clung to the ancient oaks that dotted the property, their gnarled branches casting long, skeletal shadows across the meticulously manicured lawns. 16. The very landscape seemed to whisper a warning, a stark contrast to the warm, welcoming rhetoric of its founder. But in its day, the public saw only magnificence. Fairhurst Manor was hailed as a triumph of modern charity. 5 newspapers ran glowing articles, complete with engravings of the grand structure, praising Josiah's vision and generosity. He was portrayed as a saint, a man who had dedicated his life and fortune to the service of the less fortunate. The Fairhurst Benevolent Society became a celebrated cause, a symbol of the state's enlightened progress. Wealthy patrons vied for a place on its board of directors, and the name Fairhurst became synonymous with piety and public service. No one questioned the isolation of the manor. It was framed as a necessary component of its mission, a way to provide its residents with a tranquil, contemplative environment, free from the corrupting influences of the outside world. No one questioned the sheer scale and expense of the Gothic fortress, seeing it only as a testament to the depth of Josiah's commitment. And certainly, no one looked too closely at the man himself, at the flicker of something cold and appraising that sometimes lurked behind the warmth in his eyes. The gilded facade was perfect, impenetrable. It was a masterpiece of public relations, built on a foundation of soaring rhetoric and architectural grandeur. But it was a facade, and behind its stone walls, a very different kind of institution was taking shape, one founded not on charity, but on a chillingly methodical and predatory form of greed. The genius of the Fairhursts' operation was not just in the crimes they would eventually commit, but in the meticulous construction of the virtuous world that would hide them. They understood that the greatest evils are often perpetrated not in the shadows, but in the blinding light of perceived righteousness. Every successful criminal enterprise, especially one as audacious and long-running as that of the Fairhursts, relies on a corrupt collective, a tightly knit group where each member plays a crucial, specialized role. While Josiah Fairhurst was the magnetic public face of the Benevolent Society, the architect of its noble myth, he did not act alone. The systematic horror that unfolded within the walls of Fairhurst Manor was a family affair, a monstrous trinity of shared secrets and divided labor. The second key figure, the methodical specialist of this dark trio, was Josiah's wife, Dr. Eleanor Fairhurst. On the surface, Eleanor was the perfect complement to her husband's charismatic persona. She was a woman of science and letters, one of a small but growing number of female physicians in the late 19th century. 1718 publicly. Her role was to oversee the health and well-being of the manor's residents. She was lauded for her supposed expertise in palliative care, her gentle bedside manner, and her pioneering research into the ailments of old age. She published occasional articles in medical journals, dry, academic pieces that spoke of easing the suffering of the terminally ill, earning her a reputation as a compassionate and forward-thinking practitioner. 1920, but this public image was a carefully crafted fiction. In reality, Eleanor was a woman of chilling detachment, her interest in her patients less about healing and more about clinical observation. She was precise, meticulous, and utterly devoid of the empathy she so convincingly feigned. Former staff members in later testimonies would recall her as a silent, almost spectral presence, gliding through the halls with a small, leather-bound journal in which she was constantly making notes. They spoke of her eyes, which weren't warm like her husband's, but cold and analytical, like polished gray stones. Her pioneering research was not into comfort, but into something far more sinister. The third corner of this corrupt triangle was the practical enforcer and manager, their only son, Caleb Fairhurst. If Josiah was the voice and Eleanor the mind of the operation, Caleb was its iron fist. He had none of his father's charm or his mother's intellectual polish. He was a large, taciturn man, grounded and ruthless, who managed the day-to-day logistics of the Fairhurst estate. He oversaw the staff, managed the finances, and, most importantly, handled security. It was Caleb who ensured that the manor ran with the clockwork precision of a prison, and it was Caleb who maintained the absolute privacy and isolation that was so critical to their work. He handpicked the groundskeepers and orderlies, favoring men who were intimidating, loyal, and not inclined to ask questions. The vast, swampy grounds were patrolled day and night, not just to keep intruders out, but to ensure that no one from within could leave without permission. 2122, he was the master of the physical domain, the gatekeeper who controlled all access to the Fairhursts' hidden world. Together, the trio formed a perfect, self-contained unit of criminality. Josiah, the charismatic leader, charmed the outside world, securing the funds and the victims. Dr. Eleanor, the methodical specialist, provided the scientific means and the veneer of medical legitimacy, her knowledge perverted to serve their gruesome ends. And Caleb, the practical enforcer, handled the brutal logistics, the security, and the grim, final tasks that their enterprise required. Their family dynamic was intensely insular. They presented a united, respectable front to the world, but in private, they were bound by a conspiracy of unimaginable darkness. This division of labor allowed them to operate with terrifying efficiency for decades. Each member of the family was indispensable to the whole, their individual talents and dispositions twisted into a symbiotic relationship of pure evil. The world saw a pious philanthropist, a compassionate doctor, and their diligent son, working together in the noble service of charity. They could not see the predator, the scientist, and the enforcer. This complete perversion of the family structure, turning the bonds of kinship into a criminal conspiracy, is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Fairhurst saga. They were a house united not by love or duty, but by a shared, monstrous secret that they would go to any lengths to protect. For years, the Fairhurst Benevolent Society operated without a whisper of suspicion. The grand, Gothic manor stood on its isolated patch of coastal marshland, a symbol of enlightened charity, its dark stone walls holding their secrets in absolute silence. 1112, the flow of donations was steady, the public praise unwavering, and the steady stream of destitute and elderly individuals seeking refuge continued unabated. But no fortress, no matter how well constructed, is truly impregnable forever. Eventually, a crack will appear, a small, almost insignificant fissure that, over time, can bring the entire edifice crumbling down. For the House of Fairhurst, that first crack appeared in the autumn of 1895, not with a bang, but with a quiet, persistent inquiry. The inciting incident involved the estate of a former resident, a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne had been a retired merchant who had fallen on hard times and, having no living family, had turned to the Fairhurst Society for his final years of care. Upon his death, a distant nephew, a young lawyer from Charleston named Samuel Croft, came forward. Croft possessed a letter from his uncle, written shortly after his arrival at the manor, which vaguely mentioned a small portfolio of railroad stocks that he intended to leave to his nephew as a final gift. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a sentimental matter for Croft, a final link to his departed relative. When Croft presented himself at Fairhurst Manor, he was met not with the sympathy he expected, but with a wall of polite, yet unyielding, resistance. He was received by Josiah Fairhurst himself, who, with an expression of paternal sorrow, informed the young lawyer that his uncle had arrived virtually penniless. He produced a will, a document that appeared perfectly legal and binding, signed by Marcus Thorne, which bequeathed any and all of his worldly possessions to the Benevolent Society in gratitude for its care. 2324 Croft, though disappointed, was initially prepared to accept this. But something about the situation felt wrong. The will was too clean, too comprehensive. He asked to see other records, perhaps his uncle's intake forms or personal effects, but was gently but firmly denied by Caleb Fairhurst, who cited the Society's strict privacy policies. The exchange grew tense. Josiah's practiced charm began to fray at the edges, replaced by a steely-eyed defensiveness that Croft found deeply unsettling. He left the estate not just empty-handed, but with a gnawing sense of suspicion. It was this small, unresolved conflict that planted the first seed of doubt, and by a stroke of fate, that seed found fertile ground. The story might have ended there, a minor, private grievance, had it not been for the presence of another man, a local journalist from a small, independent newspaper in a nearby town. His name was Alastair Finch. Finch was in the area working on a completely unrelated story about the changing coastal economy. He happened to be in the same public house where Samuel Croft was staying, and he overheard the young lawyer recounting his frustrating and bizarre experience at the Fairhurst estate to the innkeeper. Finch was, by nature, a skeptic and an observer of human nature. He was a man who believed that every story had a hidden layer. He had written the same glowing articles about the Fairhurst Society as every other journalist, but he had always harbored a professional curiosity about the almost mythic reputation of Josiah Fairhurst and his isolated institution. What he heard from Croft, the story of the convenient will, the aggressive stonewalling by the son, the charismatic patriarch's unsettling shift in demeanor, piqued his interest. It was the first sign of trouble, the first suggestion that the benevolent facade might be just that, a facade. Finch, our uncoverer of truth, decided to discreetly start his own inquiries. He did not yet suspect the true scale of the horror, but his journalistic instincts told him that there was a story at Fairhurst Manor far more complex than the one being told to the public. The first whispers had begun, and though they were quiet, they marked the beginning of the end for the Fairhursts' reign of terror. The fortress had been breached not by force, but by a simple, nagging question. What were they so desperately trying to hide? The confrontation with Samuel Croft, while successfully deflected, sent a subtle tremor through the Fairhursts' insular world. It was a reminder of the constant vigilance required to maintain their ghastly secret. Their criminal enterprise was not a chaotic affair. It was a highly organized system, meticulously designed and refined over years to prey upon the vulnerable, while maintaining a flawless veneer of legitimacy. At the core of this system was a process of calculated isolation, turning a house of refuge into an inescapable trap. The Fairhurst recruitment method was chillingly specific. They targeted the truly disenfranchised of society, the elderly who had outlived their families, the chronically ill with no one to care for them, immigrants who had lost their connections to their homeland, and the poor who were seen as little more than a burden on the public ledger. These were the invisible people of the Gilded Age, individuals whose disappearance would scarcely cause a ripple, let alone an investigation. Their vulnerability was their most attractive asset. Josiah himself often sought out potential residents, visiting almshouses and public infirmaries, his presence radiating a saintly compassion. He would speak to these desperate souls, offering them not just a bed and food, but dignity, peace, and the promise of a loving home for the remainder of their days. For someone facing a lonely and destitute end, the offer was irresistible. Upon agreeing to enter the Fairhurst Benevolent Society, each new resident was required to go through a formal intake process, a procedure that was, in itself, a legal masterpiece of deception. The centerpiece of this process was the signing of a will. With Josiah's gentle guidance and the imposing presence of Caleb, the residents would sign complex legal documents, drafted by a lawyer loyal to the family. These wills, which were presented as a standard formality to cover the costs of perpetual care, were in fact ironclad contracts that transferred all of the individual's current assets and any future inheritances directly to the society, 23, 24, 25, to a person with nothing. This seemed like a small price to pay for security. To the Fairhursts, it was the entire point of the transaction. Once inside the manor's gates, the process of isolation began immediately. Under the guise of providing a peaceful, cloistered environment, free from the anxieties of the outside world, communication was systematically severed. Initially, letters might be allowed, but they were heavily monitored by Caleb, who would screen them for any hint of complaint or distress. Over time, residents would be gently discouraged from writing at all, told that their focus should be on contemplation and rest. Visits from the few, distant acquaintances who might inquire were similarly managed. Visitors were never allowed to see the residents' private quarters and would meet with them only in designated, austere parlors under the watchful eye of a staff member. Soon, even these visits would be curtailed, with Josiah explaining sorrowfully that the residents' health was too fragile for the excitement. The manor, with its fortress-like walls and patrol grounds, became a one-way gate. People went in, they never came out. The staff was a crucial component of this control. Caleb hired individuals who were either fiercely loyal, well paid for their silence, or too intimidated to speak out. They were bound by strict confidentiality agreements, with the threat of immediate dismissal and financial ruin hanging over their heads. A culture of fear and silence permeated the estate. Staff members were discouraged from forming personal bonds with the residents and were trained to report any unusual behavior or conversations to Caleb immediately. Over the years, a sense of unease grew among some of the staff. They witnessed the slow, inexorable decline of once healthy residents, the strange, hushed conversations of the Fairhurst family, and the way new arrivals seemed to simply vanish over time, their absence explained away by a brief, formal announcement of a peaceful passing. But who could they tell? The Fairhursts were powerful, respected figures. To speak out against them would be professional suicide, the ramblings of a disgruntled employee against a pillar of the community. This system of isolation, legal entrapment, and psychological control was the engine of the Fairhurst operation. It created a constant supply of victims, legally stripped them of their assets, and then erased them from the world, all under the sanctimonious banner of charity. The true genius of their plan was that they had weaponized the very concept of benevolence, turning an act of compassion into the perfect, inescapable hunting ground. Alastair Finch was a man of habit and patience, qualities that made him an exceptional journalist in an era of sensationalism and yellow journalism. He was less interested in the shocking headline and more in the meticulous assembly of facts, believing that the truth, when fully revealed, was always more powerful than any fabrication. His brief encounter with the story of Samuel Croft had lit a small fire of curiosity within him, a professional itch that he could not ignore. He began to dig, not with a shovel, but with the quiet, persistent tools of his trade, public records, archives, and the slow cultivation of sources. His investigation into the Fairhurst Benevolent Society started not at the imposing manor itself, but in the dusty, ledger-filled rooms of the county courthouse. He spent weeks poring over property deeds, tax assessments, and most importantly, death certificates. It was here that he found the first tangible anomaly. He began to compile a list of all known residents who had died at Fairhurst Manor since its inception. The sheer number was startling. For an institution that promised care and longevity, the mortality rate seemed unusually high, even accounting for the advanced age and infirmity of its residents. Yet, on paper, everything was in perfect order. Every single death certificate was signed by the esteemed Dr. Eleanor Fairhurst, and every cause of death was plausible, even mundane: pneumonia, heart failure, consumption, the natural and expected ailments of the elderly. 19. There were no red flags, no suspicious causes that would warrant official inquiry. The paperwork was immaculate, a testament to Eleanor's clinical precision. But for Finch, the pattern itself was the problem. There were too many deaths, too consistently, and all certified by a single interested party. It was a closed loop of information, with no external verification. He started to cross-reference the names of the deceased with probate court records and land registries, a painstaking process of historical detective work. Here, a second, more disturbing pattern began to emerge. He found that a significant number of the deceased, like Marcus Thorne, were not entirely destitute as the society claimed. Many were the last surviving members of their families, and as such were the sole inheritors of modest, often forgotten assets. Small parcels of land in other counties, dormant bank accounts, or shares in obscure companies. 24 of these assets, upon their death at the manor, were invariably and legally transferred to the Fairhurst Benevolent Society, as stipulated by the wills they had signed upon entry. The Fairhursts weren't just taking in the poor, they were systematically targeting the isolated but propertied. This was not charity. It was a sophisticated and predatory form of asset stripping. Finch realized he was onto something far more significant than a simple case of inheritance fraud. He was looking at a potential pattern of systematic exploitation. But he needed more than just statistics and property records. He needed a human source, an eyewitness, someone who had been inside the fortress and could speak to what truly happened behind its silent stone facade. He began to discreetly search for former employees of the estate, a difficult task given Caleb Fairhurst's penchant for hiring loyalists and enforcing strict confidentiality. He visited taverns and boarding houses in the towns surrounding the Fairhurst property, dropping the family's name in casual conversation, listening to local gossip, hoping to find a thread. He was looking for the one thing every corrupt organization inevitably produces: a disgruntled employee. A man who had been fired, who felt wronged, and whose loyalty had soured into a desire for retribution. Alastair Finch's investigation was a slow burn, a gradual accumulation of shadows and whispers. He was a lone figure moving against a powerful and respected institution, a single point of skepticism in a world of complacent belief. He was the uncoverer of truth, driven by the core journalistic conviction that facts, when patiently gathered and carefully arranged, could illuminate even the darkest of secrets. He did not know it yet, but he was on the trail of one of the most monstrous serial murder conspiracies in the nation's history, and his patient, analytical pursuit of the truth was the only hope for the countless victims whose stories had been systematically erased. The turning point in Alastair Finch's quiet investigation came on a cold, rain-swept evening in a grimy dockside tavern miles from the manicured lawns of Fairhurst Manor. After weeks of dead ends and cautious inquiries, he finally found what he was looking for: a man nursing a cheap whiskey and a deep-seated grudge against the Fairhurst family. His name was Thomas Gregory, a former groundskeeper who had been summarily dismissed by Caleb Fairhurst 6 months prior for alleged drunkenness on the job, a charge Gregory vehemently denied. He was a man with nothing left to lose and a burning desire for payback. Initially, Gregory was reluctant to talk, his fear of the Fairhursts still palpable. But Finch, with his calm demeanor and a few rounds of whiskey, slowly earned his trust. The journalist didn't press for scandalous revelations, but instead asked about the day-to-day life at the estate, about the family themselves. Gregory spoke of Caleb's tyrannical management style and Dr. Eleanor's cold, spectral presence. He talked about the pervasive atmosphere of secrecy and the high turnover of staff who asked too many questions. But it was a specific, bizarre memory that made the hairs on Finch's arm stand up. Gregory recounted a night late in the previous year, when he had been making his rounds near the main house. Through a ground-floor window of Josiah Fairhurst's private study, he witnessed a strange and unsettling ritual. Josiah was seated at his large oak desk, not with his usual stack of correspondence, but with a single ornate legal document spread before him. Standing beside him was a new resident, a frail, elderly woman who looked terrified. What was odd was the signing. Instead of a normal inkwell, Josiah had a small, dark glass vial on his desk. When it came time for him to affix his own signature as the executor, he did not use a conventional pen. Instead, he took up a long, sharpened quill, uncorked the vial, and dipped the tip into the dark, viscous liquid within. Gregory swore it wasn't black ink. In the lamplight, it had a deep ruby-red glint. It was, he insisted, blood. Finch sat there, stunned, the noisy tavern fading into a dull roar. The story was fantastical, macabre, something out of a Gothic horror novel. Yet, the groundskeeper told it with such conviction, with the fine details of a genuine memory, that Finch couldn't dismiss it. The image was seared into his mind, the charismatic philanthropist, the saint of the destitute, signing a last will and testament in what appeared to be human blood. This was the dark, ritualistic heart of the conspiracy he had been circling. It was the detail that transformed the story from one of financial fraud into something far more sinister and depraved. It was the macabre signature of the Fairhurst family's evil. Now we have to pause here. If you're finding this journey into one of history's darkest chapters as compelling as I do, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone you know who appreciates these hidden stories. It truly helps our channel grow and allows us to bring more of these suppressed histories to light. And, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and have notifications turned on. You will not want to miss the climax of this investigation and the full revelation of the horrors that were uncovered at Fairhurst Manor. What Alastair Finch had just learned was a game changer. It was anecdotal, yes, and would be dismissed by any authority as the ravings of a drunk. But for Finch, it was the key. It provided a potential explanation for the statistical anomalies and the missing assets. He now believed that the Fairhursts weren't just swindling their residents, they were murdering them. And they were commemorating their crimes with a grotesque, ritualistic signature. The investigation had now entered a new, terrifying phase. Finch was no longer just a journalist chasing a story about fraud. He was an investigator hunting monsters. The groundskeeper's chilling testimony about the blood signature opened a terrifying new dimension in Alastair Finch's investigation. It suggested a level of ritualistic depravity that went beyond mere greed. To understand the how behind this macabre operation, Finch now turned his focus to the one person in the Fairhurst triumvirate with the knowledge and skill to orchestrate death on such a systematic and undetectable scale, Dr. Eleanor Fairhurst. Publicly, she was the compassionate caregiver, the expert in easing the final days of the infirm. 18 privately, she was the architect of their deaths, a methodical specialist whose scientific curiosity had been perverted into a tool for murder. Eleanor's true work took place in a private laboratory, hidden away in a secluded wing of the manor, a space to which only she and her husband had access. It was a place that starkly contrasted with the Gothic grandeur of the rest of the estate. It was a room of cold, clinical utility, filled with beakers, distillation coils, microscopes, and rows upon rows of carefully labeled botanical samples. Here, she pursued her real pioneering research, the art and science of toxicology. Her specialty was the formulation of poisons from natural sources, particularly from the obscure and potent flora native to the surrounding Carolina swamplands. 26, she was a master of her craft, developing compounds that were not only lethal, but also difficult, if not impossible, to detect in a post-mortem examination of that era. 27, 28, 29. She knew that arsenic, a common choice for poisoners, was becoming easier to identify with the advent of the Marsh test. 28. So she focused on more esoteric substances, alkaloids from plants like wolfsbane or water hemlock, and complex toxins derived from fungi and venomous insects found in the marsh. These substances could mimic the symptoms of natural diseases, particularly the heart failure and respiratory distress common in the elderly, making her diagnoses on the death certificates medically unassailable. 29. The key to understanding her monstrous mindset was discovered much later, after the fall of the House of Fairhurst, when investigators unearthed her private journals. These were not diaries of personal reflection, but cold, scientific logbooks. Written in a precise, elegant script and filled with complex chemical notations, they documented her experiments. She never referred to the residents by name. They were simply subjects, assigned numbers upon their arrival. The journals contained detailed observations of her methods, meticulously recording dosages, administration techniques, and the precise timeline of the subject's subsequent decline and death. A translated and deciphered entry regarding Subject 74 reads in part, administered compound 12-beta, derived from Aconitum uncinnatum, in the evening broth. Dosage, 4 milligrams. Initial symptoms of nausea and arrhythmia presented within 3 hours, consistent with projections. Subject complained of gastric distress, which was treated with a simple milk of magnesia placebo. Over the next 48 hours, a progressive paralysis of the peripheral nervous system was observed. Cardiac function became increasingly erratic. Final cessation occurred at 5:17 a.m. on the third day. The presentation is virtually indistinguishable from acute congestive heart failure. Certificate of death will reflect as such. The efficacy of the compound is confirmed. Further refinement may reduce the timeline by several hours. This chillingly detached language reveals the true nature of Dr. Eleanor Fairhurst. She was not a healer, but a predator who viewed human life as nothing more than a variable in her ghastly experiments. Her work provided the essential mechanism for the family's criminal enterprise. While Josiah selected the targets and Caleb managed the physical prison, it was Eleanor who held the power of life and death. She was the one who decided when a resident's time was up, when their assets had fully matured, or when their presence was no longer convenient. She would then administer her bespoke poisons, watch them die with the dispassionate eye of a researcher, and finally sign the death certificate that officially erased her crime. She was, in every sense, a monster hiding in plain sight, her medical degree a shield, her laboratory a secret altar for the worship of death. The scientific precision of her work is what allowed the Fairhursts to operate for so long without suspicion, turning the manor into a veritable production line of death, with each passing soul adding to the family's ever-growing fortune. With their system perfected, Josiah's recruitment, Eleanor's poisons, and Caleb's control, the Fairhurst operation entered its most audacious and prolific phase. The initial caution they had exercised began to erode, replaced by a chilling confidence born of years of success. Greed, once the primary motivator, grew into a voracious and insatiable appetite. They were no longer content to simply wait for the naturally isolated and elderly to seek them out. The family began to proactively identify and pursue their victims with the cold calculation of seasoned hunters. Josiah Fairhurst, using the society's sterling reputation as his cover, expanded his reach. He would travel to other cities, using his network of church and civic leaders to identify potential benefactors for his esteemed institution. His criteria remained the same: individuals with wealth, however modest, and no close family to ask questions. But now he also began targeting those who were not terminally ill or even elderly. A middle-aged widow who had recently inherited her husband's business, a bachelor who had received a windfall from a distant relative. These individuals, in the prime of their lives, became targets. The promise was no longer just end-of-life care, but a life of leisure and security, a respite from the lonely burdens of managing an estate. Once these new, healthier residents were within the walls of the manor, the timeline for their demise was brutally accelerated. It was Dr. Eleanor who made the final determination. In her coded journals, entries began to shift from purely scientific observation to cold, financial calculation. An entry from this period noted, Subject 98 possesses shares in the Southern Rail expansion. A significant appreciation in value is anticipated within the next fiscal quarter. His continued vitality presents a logistical and financial impediment. A course of treatment is to be scheduled post-haste. The course of treatment was, of course, a death sentence. The atmosphere of dread within Fairhurst Manor, once a subtle undercurrent, became a thick, suffocating fog. The residents, who had arrived full of hope for a peaceful sanctuary, slowly realized their predicament. They were not guests, they were prisoners. Their initial isolation, once framed as a feature, was now clearly a method of control. They saw their fellow residents, people who seemed perfectly healthy one day, suddenly take ill with a mysterious and rapid sickness, only to be pronounced dead by Dr. Fairhurst a few days later. A quiet, unspoken terror gripped the community. Whispers in the hallways would cease the moment a staff member approached. Eyes would dart nervously at mealtimes, each resident wondering if the evening broth contained their own dose of Eleanor's medicine. Desperate attempts were made to get word to the outside world. Notes were scrawled on scraps of paper and hidden, hoping a sympathetic staff member might find them. A resident might feign a medical emergency, hoping for an outside doctor to be called in, only to be met by the cold, dismissive presence of Eleanor Fairhurst, who would allow no other physician to attend to her patients. These small acts of rebellion were always discovered. Caleb's network of loyal staff was ruthlessly efficient. Any resident caught trying to communicate with the outside, or even suspected of fomenting dissent, would be the next to fall ill. The disappearances served as a stark and brutal warning to the others. Resistance was futile. This escalation marked the height of the Fairhursts' monstrous reign. The facade of benevolence was still firmly in place for the outside world, but within the manor's walls, the pretense had all but vanished. It was a charnel house, a place where human lives were weighed on a financial ledger and extinguished with scientific precision. The family was no longer just committing murder for profit. They were running a factory of death, fueled by an unchecked avarice that had consumed any last vestiges of their humanity. The sheer number of victims from this period is what ultimately led to the staggering count of unmarked graves discovered a century later, each one a testament to the family's escalating depravity. The Fairhurst Manor was more than a home, it was a fortress, and its warden was Caleb Fairhurst. While his father charmed the world and his mother perfected the art of silent murder, it was Caleb who managed the physical reality of their monstrous enterprise. He was the grounding force of their corruption, the ruthless pragmatist who ensured the smooth, secure, and silent operation of their charnel house. His domain was the estate itself, the imposing Gothic building, the vast swampy grounds, and the people, both staff and residents, who lived within its confines. Caleb was a man of routine and intimidation. He started each day before dawn, walking the perimeter of the property, his large frame a familiar and menacing silhouette against the rising sun. His face, often set in a permanent scowl, and his quiet, commanding presence were enough to quell any dissent among the staff. He had an almost preternatural ability to sense trouble, to identify the weak link or the questioning glance. He ruled through fear, not loyalty. The staff he hired were chosen for specific traits: a lack of curiosity, a desperate need for the high wages the Fairhursts paid, and often a past that made them unlikely to go to the authorities. These men, particularly the groundskeepers and orderlies who patrolled the estate, were Caleb's private army. They understood that their primary job was not maintenance or care, but surveillance and enforcement. Their loyalty was to Caleb, and their silence was handsomely rewarded. The most critical and gruesome of Caleb's responsibilities was the management of the disappearances. When his mother, Dr. Eleanor, decided a resident's time was up, it was Caleb who handled the grim logistics that followed. After Eleanor pronounced the death, always from natural causes, Caleb would oversee the immediate and discreet removal of the body from the resident's room, typically in the dead of night. The official story given to the remaining residents, and in any public record, was that the deceased had been interred in a respectable cemetery in a nearby city. This was a complete fabrication. No bodies ever left the Fairhurst estate. Instead, Caleb had designated a remote, unconsecrated patch of ground at the far edge of the property, deep within the humid, insect-infested marshland where the ancient cypress trees grew thickest. 2122. This was the Fairhursts' private graveyard. Under Caleb's direct supervision, a small, trusted crew of his most loyal men would dig a simple, unmarked grave. There were no coffins, no ceremonies, no markers. The bodies were unceremoniously placed in the damp earth, and the ground was carefully covered over, the natural vegetation replaced to erase any sign of disturbance. It was a ruthlessly efficient system of disposal that ensured their secret remained buried, literally, beneath the swampy soil of their own land. Caleb was the wall that separated the Fairhursts' world of horror from the outside world of blissful ignorance. He was the one who intercepted mail, who turned away unexpected visitors with convincing stories of quarantine or fragile health, and who dealt with any external inquiries with a blunt, intimidating finality. He was the practical enforcer who ensured that the fortress his father had built remained impregnable. While Josiah spun tales of benevolence and Eleanor scribbled in her journals of death, Caleb was the one with dirt under his fingernails. He was the one who stared into the open graves, who managed the grim inventory of the dead, and who ensured that the earth kept its secrets. His role was less glamorous than his father's, less cerebral than his mother's, but it was arguably the most essential. Without Caleb's ruthless efficiency and his talent for managing the brutal mechanics of their crimes, the Fairhurst Benevolent Society would have collapsed under the weight of its own darkness long before it did. He was the silent, brutal partner who made the entire nightmare possible. In a system built on total control and isolation, the greatest threat is always the unpredictable variable of human connection. For all their meticulous planning, the Fairhursts could not completely extinguish the spark of empathy in everyone they employed. That spark, however small, would ultimately become the kindling for the inferno that would consume them. It was found in a young, frightened kitchen hand named Sarah, and it was fanned into a flame by the courage of a resident named Eliza Vance. Eliza was a former schoolteacher from a small town in the mountains. She had come to Fairhurst Manor several years prior, a widow with a modest inheritance and no children, only a distant niece with whom she had lost touch. Eliza was intelligent and observant. She had watched the patterns within the manor, the sudden illnesses, the hushed disappearances, the palpable fear in the eyes of her fellow residents. Unlike many others who succumbed to despair, Eliza's terror sharpened her resolve. She knew she had to get word out, but the risk was immense. She had seen what happened to those who were caught trying to resist. Her chance came through Sarah, a young woman barely out of her teens, who had been hired to help in the manor's massive kitchens. Sarah was quiet, easily intimidated, and terrified of the brooding Caleb Fairhurst. But she also possessed a fundamental decency that the Fairhursts had failed to screen for. She saw the fear and sadness in the residents' faces, and it affected her deeply. Eliza began to cultivate a careful, subtle friendship with the young kitchen hand. She would engage her in quiet conversation, speaking of her former life as a teacher, of the books she loved, and of her estranged niece. She sensed in Sarah a sympathetic soul. After weeks of building this fragile trust, Eliza made her move. One evening, as Sarah was clearing her dinner tray, Eliza slipped a small, tightly folded piece of paper into the girl's hand, her own hand trembling as she did so. "For the love of God," Eliza whispered, her eyes pleading, "see that this finds its way to a post box outside this place. It is the only hope for us." The note was not a direct accusation. Eliza was too clever for that. A direct allegation of murder would be dismissed as the ravings of a senile old woman. Instead, the letter was a masterpiece of desperate subtlety. Addressed to her niece, it was filled with melancholic reflections on her own fading health, describing strange symptoms that came and went, a pervasive lethargy, and a deep sense of unease that she couldn't shake. She wrote of the loneliness and the profound silence of the place, and of how several of her new friends had recently passed away after suffering from similar, baffling afflictions. She ended the letter with a simple, haunting plea. "I find myself terribly afraid, though I cannot say precisely why. I pray you receive this, and I pray you think of me." Sarah was petrified. She knew the risk she was taking. If Caleb discovered the letter, she would be dismissed instantly, and she feared far worse. For 2 days, the folded paper felt like a burning coal in her pocket. But Eliza's terrified, pleading face haunted her. On her next scheduled day off, her hands shaking, Sarah secreted the letter out of the manor and mailed it from a neighboring town. The letter, against all odds, found its way to Eliza's niece. The niece, concerned but unsure what to do, shared the letter with her husband. As fate would have it, her husband was a subscriber to Alastair Finch's small newspaper and had been following the journalist's occasional, cautiously worded articles questioning the financial practices of various benevolent institutions. Remembering Finch's name, he made a decision that would change everything. He forwarded Eliza's desperate letter to the one man he knew of who was already looking at the Fairhursts with a skeptical eye. When Alastair Finch received the letter, he knew he finally had it. This was not a statistic or a second-hand story from a disgruntled employee. This was a voice from inside the fortress, a primary source. The letter was his key, the catalyst he needed to transform his private investigation into an official inquiry. The breaking point had been reached. A simple act of courage from a condemned woman and an act of compassion from a frightened girl had breached the walls of the Fairhursts' fortress of evil. The end was now in sight. The arrival of Eliza Vance's letter was the fulcrum upon which the entire case turned. For Alastair Finch, it was the missing piece of the puzzle, a human voice that gave soul and urgency to his cold, hard data. He now possessed a trifecta of evidence: the statistical anomalies in the death rates and financial records, the eyewitness testimony of the groundskeeper about the blood ritual, and now a desperate plea from within the very walls of the institution itself. It was enough. The time for quiet, solitary investigation was over. With a mixture of professional resolve and personal dread, Finch gathered his meticulously organized files and traveled to the state capitol. His first stop was the office of the state attorney general. He knew this would be an uphill battle. The Fairhurst family was not just wealthy, they were politically connected. Josiah Fairhurst was a celebrated public figure, a friend to governors and congressmen, a man whose reputation was, on the surface, utterly unassailable. Presenting a case against him based on the testimony of a disgraced groundskeeper and a letter from a possibly senile woman was a monumental risk. The initial meeting was exactly as skeptical as Finch had feared. The Attorney General, a man who had shared a stage with Josiah Fairhurst at numerous charity functions, listened with polite but visible disbelief. He reviewed Finch's data, the lists of names, the property transfers. He read Eliza's letter. He listened to the story of the blood signature. His first instinct was to dismiss it all as a conspiracy theory, the product of an overzealous journalist and unreliable sources. "Mr. Finch," the Attorney General said, his tone weary, "you are making an extraordinary accusation against one of the state's most respected citizens. Josiah Fairhurst is a pillar of our community. Dr. Fairhurst is a respected physician." But Finch was prepared. He didn't argue with passion, he argued with facts. He calmly walked the Attorney General through the undeniable statistical patterns. "Look at the timeline," Finch urged, pointing to his charts. In a dozen separate instances, a resident of the manor dies within weeks of a distant relative passing away and leaving them an unexpected inheritance. And in every single one of those cases, the inheritance is immediately absorbed by the society. Is that charity, or is that a business model? He then presented his analysis of Dr. Eleanor Fairhurst's public writings, contrasting her published work on gentle, palliative care with the shockingly high and rapid mortality rates at the manor. The final, and perhaps most persuasive, piece was Eliza's letter. Its tone of quiet, lucid terror was deeply unsettling. It did not read like the product of a delusional mind. It read like a prisoner's last, desperate message in a bottle. The Attorney General, though still deeply skeptical, was a man of the law. The sheer volume of circumstantial evidence gave him pause. The potential for a scandal of this magnitude, if true, was unthinkable. If he ignored it and Finch's allegations were later proven correct, his own career would be finished. Reluctantly, he agreed to authorize a discreet, preliminary inquiry. He assigned 2 of his best investigators to the case, with strict instructions to proceed with the utmost caution and secrecy. The investigation had now officially begun. Finch had passed the torch to the authorities, but his work was far from over. He continued to dig, feeding the state investigators new leads and historical data as he uncovered them. The tension began to build, a slow, tightening knot of suspense. The state investigators began their own covert work, re-interviewing the groundskeeper Thomas Gregory, seeking out other former staff members, and secretly verifying Finch's financial analysis. The Fairhursts, cocooned in their fortress of arrogance and power, remained oblivious. They continued their gruesome work, unaware that the world they had so carefully constructed was about to be shattered. The wheels of justice, though they had started to turn with agonizing slowness, were now grinding inexorably toward the gates of Fairhurst Manor. The final days of the House of Fairhurst unfolded with the grim inevitability of a Greek tragedy. While the state's investigators quietly built their case, life and death at the manor continued its macabre routine. But the net was closing. Armed with corroborating testimony from 2 other former staff members and a financial audit that confirmed Finch's darkest suspicions, the Attorney General finally had enough. He could no longer ignore the mountain of evidence. On a gray, overcast morning in the early spring of 1898, he signed the warrant. The raid on Fairhurst Manor was planned with the precision of a military operation. A convoy of lawmen, led by the state investigators and accompanied by a visibly tense Alastair Finch, made its way down the long, cypress-lined driveway. The raid was a complete surprise. The lawmen stormed the main building, securing all entrances and exits before the family could react. The scene they encountered was one of surreal and defiant calm. Josiah Fairhurst, interrupted during his breakfast, met the investigators with an expression of profound, theatrical indignation. "On what authority do you invade this house of God?" he boomed, his voice resonating with its practiced authority. "This is a place of sanctuary, a private institution of care. You are trespassing." Dr. Eleanor Fairhurst appeared moments later, a spectral figure in a simple gray dress. She exhibited no surprise, no fear, only a cold, clinical curiosity. She watched the proceedings with the detached air of a scientist, observing an interesting but irrelevant phenomenon. Caleb, true to his role, was the only one who offered physical resistance. He attempted to block the officers from proceeding further into the house, his large frame filling a doorway, his face a mask of pure rage. He was quickly and decisively subdued. As the family was detained in the grand parlor, the investigators, guided by Finch's notes and the layout provided by former staff, began their search. The discoveries came in a series of shocking waves. First, they found Josiah's office. In a locked drawer of his desk, they discovered a meticulously organized collection of last wills and testaments, hundreds of them, each one legally bequeathing all of a resident's assets to the Benevolent Society. 24. Next, they located Dr. Eleanor's hidden laboratory. The room, whose existence had been a secret to all but the family, was a horrifying confirmation of their theories. It was filled with toxicology equipment, samples of poisonous plants, and most damningly, her collection of coded journals. 1920, an initial glance at the precise, chilling entries was enough to make even the most hardened investigator recoil in horror. But the most gruesome discovery was yet to come. While one team searched the house, another, guided by the groundskeeper Thomas Gregory, proceeded to the far edge of the property, to the damp, overgrown area by the swamp. 1-3, with shovels in hand, they began to dig at a spot Gregory indicated. For a long time, there was only the sound of metal scraping against wet earth. Then a shovel struck something solid. It wasn't rock. An investigator knelt down and carefully cleared away the soil, revealing the curved, yellowed bone of a human skull. A collective gasp went through the assembled men. They had found the first one. They widened the excavation, and soon the outlines of a complete skeleton emerged from the shallow grave. They moved to another spot a few feet away and began to dig again. Another skeleton, and then another, and another. As the gray sky began to weep a cold, steady rain, the full, horrific truth of Fairhurst Manor was finally being unearthed. The fortress had fallen. The raid had shattered the family's impenetrable facade, revealing the charnel house that lay beneath. For Josiah, the charismatic leader, his authority had evaporated. For Eleanor, the methodical specialist, her scientific secrets were exposed. And for Caleb, the practical enforcer, his walls had been breached. The dark reign of the Fairhurst family was over, and the true accounting of their crimes was about to begin. The trial of the Fairhurst family was a national sensation. Newspapers from Boston to San Francisco dispatched their best reporters to the small Carolina courthouse, eager to recount every lurid detail of the House of Horrors. The courtroom was packed daily with a morbidly curious public, all craning their necks to get a look at the monstrous family that had operated for so long under the guise of sainthood. The prosecution, led by the state attorney general himself, laid out its case with methodical precision, using the Fairhursts' own meticulous records against them. Alastair Finch was the star witness, his calm, factual testimony detailing his long, patient investigation and providing the narrative framework for the entire case. One by one, terrified former staff members took the stand, their voices often trembling as they recounted the atmosphere of fear, the sudden illnesses, and the absolute power wielded by Caleb Fairhurst. The groundskeeper, Thomas Gregory, gave his chilling account of a late-night ritual, of seeing Josiah Fairhurst sign a will with a quill dipped in a vial of what he swore was blood. But the most damning evidence came from Dr. Eleanor Fairhurst's own hand. Her coded journals, painstakingly deciphered by experts, were read aloud in the courtroom. The clinical, dispassionate descriptions of her lethal experiments, her references to her victims as mere subjects, and her cold calculations of their financial worth sent a wave of revulsion through the gallery. Here, in her own words, was the confession of a monster. The journals revealed the full scope of her scientific depravity, from the harvesting of obscure poisons in the Carolina swamps to the precise calibration of lethal dosages designed to mimic natural death. 27, 28, 29, the final and most macabre revelation of the trial concerned the very mystery that had first drawn Alastair Finch into the story: the signing of the wills. The prosecution brought in a forensic expert from London, one of the few men in the world specializing in the new science of blood analysis. He had examined the dozens of wills seized from Josiah's office, specifically the strange reddish-black ink of Josiah Fairhurst's signature on each document. His testimony delivered the trial's horrifying climax. The ink, he confirmed, was indeed human blood. But the horror did not stop there. Using primitive but effective comparison techniques, he had been able to test the blood on the wills against tissue samples taken from the recently exhumed bodies. He revealed the true nature of the Fairhurst ritual. The blood used to sign each will belonged to the victim of the previous murder. It was a continuous, ritualistic chain of death. When a resident was murdered, Eleanor would extract a vial of their blood before the body was disposed of by Caleb. That vial would then be used by Josiah to sign the will of the next victim, a symbolic act of transference, a monstrous sacrament that passed the legacy of death from one soul to the next. It was an act of ultimate possession, a signature that declared their total ownership, not just over their victim's property, but over their very lives and deaths. This revelation was the final, unthinkable horror. The courtroom sat in stunned, horrified silence. This was not just murder for greed. This was a calculated, ritualistic evil of a kind no one had ever imagined. The Fairhursts were not simply criminals. They were practitioners of a dark, private religion of death, with wealth as their idol and human blood as their sacred ink. There was no defense they could offer. Josiah's blustering denials of persecution now seemed pathetic. Eleanor's cold attachment was seen for the monstrous emptiness it was. Caleb's silent rage was the fury of a cornered animal. The jury's deliberation was short. They were found guilty on all counts. The reign of the House of Fairhurst had ended, not just in a court of law, but in the unveiling of a profound and nearly incomprehensible human evil. The conviction of the Fairhursts brought an end to the trial, but not to the story. The aftermath left a deep and permanent scar on the community and the state, a chilling testament to the darkness that can hide behind a mask of virtue. Josiah, Eleanor, and Caleb Fairhurst were sentenced to hang, a fate they met with the same characteristics they had displayed throughout their lives. Josiah with defiant, self-righteous proclamations of his innocence to the very end. Eleanor with a silent, unnerving placidity, and Caleb with a final, guttural roar of impotent rage. Their executions were a public spectacle, but they offered little comfort or closure. The true number of their victims could never be known. The official count of unmarked graves on the property reached 143, but investigators and Alastair Finch always believed the number was far higher. One for every body found. How many others were there from the early years, whose remains had long since been reclaimed by the acidic soil of the swamp? How many residents' deaths were never even recorded? The Fairhursts Benevolent Society was dissolved, its name forever tarnished and transformed from a symbol of charity into a byword for unimaginable horror. The manor itself, the Gothic fortress that had been the stage for so much suffering, was abandoned. No one wanted to buy it, and the state had no desire to preserve it. It was left to the elements, a monument to greed and deception. Over the decades, the roof collapsed, the walls crumbled, and the surrounding marshland began to reclaim the land. 21. The Spanish moss, once a mere decoration, now seemed like the very spirit of the place, slowly strangling the remains of the house, pulling it back into the earth. Today, only a few crumbling stone foundations remain, a skeletal ruin hidden deep in the protected coastal wetlands, a place that local lore says is still haunted by the 100 souls who were promised sanctuary and found only a nameless grave. The victims were the story's most profound tragedy. They were the vulnerable, the forgotten, the people whose isolation made them perfect targets. 10. In the end, a public memorial was erected near the site, a simple granite wall bearing the names of the 143 identified dead and a single poignant inscription: to the souls forgotten by the world, but remembered here. May they find in eternity the peace they were denied in life. The story of the Fairhursts serves as a dark and enduring cautionary tale. It reveals how easily evil can flourish when it wears the disguise of benevolence, and how quickly a society can be blinded by the charm of a charismatic leader. It is a story about the perversion of knowledge, the corruption of family, and the insatiable nature of greed. It reminds us that the most vulnerable among us deserve not only our charity, but our protection and our vigilance. So what do we take away from this descent into one of history's darkest chapters? Does evil on this scale arise from a unique monstrosity, or does it grow from the more common seeds of greed and deception that exist in all of us? Can we ever truly know what secrets are kept behind the closed doors of our most respected institutions? These are the questions that these histories force us to ask. They challenge us to look beyond the surface, to question authority, and to listen for the whispers of those who have no voice. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you believe these stories matter, if you believe that confronting the darkness of the past is essential to understanding the present, then please support our work. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you are the first to know about our next investigation, comment with your thoughts on this story, and share it with others who are not afraid to look into the abyss. We are a community of truth seekers, and it is an honor to have you among us. Until next time, keep questioning.